So my name is Linda Lucia Santana. I am from California. I was born and raised in the Central Valley, but right now I live in Idlewild, which is in Southern California. It's in the mountains right above Palm Springs. And I studied at UC Santa Cruz. That's where I did my undergraduate studies, and I went to graduate school at the University of North Texas in Denton, Texas. In my graduate research, I felt like I was slowly becoming a corridista. And as a Chicana, it was difficult for me to take on that ownership, be like, well, who am I to be doing this, right? But then I was like, no, this is part of my culture, and I have something to say, right? And there's a whole, there's all this information that needs to be shared that I want to bring up, right? Because being from like California, Mexico, Texas, right? They're all imagined borders, they're all created borders. And that always fascinated me, like the borderlands, it's kind of nebulous. And I was really sitting with this idea of the corrido and how it's a very unique form, musical form to the Americas, right? It's taking the Spanish romance and turning it into like ballads for the people. Indigenous people, people of color, they were excluded from the historical record, right? They weren't included in birth records or death records. And so that whole era is gone. So I think corridos visuales for me, like that's just a way of life. That's how I look at the world, and that's what I grew up in. And that's why I wanted to make new work for this show specifically. This series is a call for the viewer to think about their ancestors, to think about their roots and where they came from, right? Because I think there's a sense of loss in being Chicano, of not really knowing how far back our roots go. And so this series for me was reclaiming that narrative, right? And giving a voice to those ancestors that were excluded from the historical record. For me, this was a really meaningful experience of creating these, of thinking what these women would have looked like, what their stories were, right? They weren't glamorous. They weren't, they were the throwaway women. They were the ones that the hacendados used and threw out. And then they were stuck with the shame. So that's why I named this series El Corrido de las Tatarabuelas. So tatarabuelas means great-great-grandmothers, right? And I love that in Spanish that there's a word for that, right? It's not just adding great to it, Bisabuela is great-grandmother, and tatarabuela is great-great-grandmother. And so that's what I wanted to speak to, because this is like the 1830s to 1860s. It's that weird time of imperialism and colonialism that wasn't really recorded, right? We were completely excluded from those historical records. So for me, I'm kind of using elements of magic realism in this. And they're made to look like giant tintypes, right? Because they weren't photographed. These people were not photographed at all. There's a sadness in their imagery, and that's something that I was feeling when I was doing my research, and I think that shows in the images. At first, I was like, oh man, they're too dark. They're kind of depressing, and they're kind of shrouded in shadow. And I was like, well, they are, and they were. And I think that's a big part of being Latinx too. I mean, how many of us can really trace our roots that far back? So they're all El Corrido de la Tatarabuela, but one of them is titled, What Were Your Dreams? With her, she has a shawl. You can kind of see the outline of it, but it's a baby carrying shawl. Because I wanted to show that, because their legacy lives on through us, right? Through their blood, through, we were born of them. So that's why I wanted to honor that in that piece. Another one is called, What is Your Story? How would they frame it if they were asked to put it in their own words? How would they share that? And the last one is, what would you like us to know about you? These are all questions I would love to step back and ask them. But with these pieces, I wanted to instill a little bit of magic, right? Because they're not photographs, but they're shown to be in that style because we did exist. We just don't have a record of it. So I wanted to create that.
My name is John Medina. I am originally from Corpus Christi, Texas, but currently I live in San Antonio, Texas. I've been here for over 10 years now, and I work here as an artist, a designer, and also an educator. I teach high school art. I'm also the fine arts director at the school that I teach at, and you know, I got my undergrad or my BFA from Texas A&M University, Corpus Christi. And then I got my MFA from Northern Illinois University in DeKalb, Illinois. You know, what's influenced my work like throughout the entire my entire art career is trying to look at materials in a different way, and trying to use those materials to tell the story of my identity. Most of the work that I do is about identity. It's about where I come from. It's about, you know, my experiences living and growing up in South Texas, and you know, just about the things that I've experienced as a young person, or when I was a young person. I'm not young anymore, but you know, just the observations and trying to connect that to my upbringing. So, you know, the first painting that I think I submitted was the serape piece. So serape is basically different colors of, I mean, it's meant to mimic the patterns of a Mexican blanket, which is called a serape. It's a traditional Mexican tapestry. And I've always loved those. Like, we've always had them in the house when I was growing up, and it's something that you're just very familiar with. And people love the patterns. The patterns are really colorful. And they're really, you know, just vibrant, and people, you know, like to use them for interior design and stuff. And so what I wanted to do was take that pattern and apply one of my aesthetics to it, which is abstraction, right? So one of the things that I've liked to do in my artwork is, you know, I use a narrative, but my artwork tends to be really abstracted. So by taking away like the texture, taking away the form of the blanket, taking away the actual like fibers, and just breaking it down to just colors, right? And so we have like stripes of color that have been repeated over and over again. One of the other themes that I've tried to tackle within my artwork is how I can take my identity as a Latino and fit that within the context of art history. And so I think that that's something that's not done, right? Like, if we look at art history and we look at like a lot of the contemporary and modern art that we're taught, like it's a lot of white people, right? It's a lot of white guys that are making these abstractions. And so I feel like what's represented there, the stories and the narratives that are there, even though they're abstract, they don't belong to people like me, right? And so I'm trying to use that visual language, but to tell my own stories using that visual language. And so the serape piece was another version of abstraction that I was trying to use. Where I continued that was with the Mexican Coke piece. That piece is an experimentation of, you know, taking this new technology that I had access to, and, you know, just trying to apply it to the narrative that I was creating with the serapes. You know, I have a love for printmaking. I have a love for advertising. You know, and as cliche as it is, like, I have a love for Andy Warhol and a lot of the prints that he was making. And so it was my way, same thing, like taking that sort of art history context of like an Andy Warhol print and just like injecting my heritage into that. So using that sort of visual language, but to tell a totally different story with it. I wanted to have a sense of history and a sense of age to it. So there's like some spotting on the paper. The texture of the paper in the background looks like newsprint. So it's meant to have this sort of like history to it, even though it's you know, it's a new piece that was created using technology. Then I have the rice and bean series. This was just like really an experiment I was trying to figure out. And I thought, you know, how can I take this idea of a stencil and apply it towards, you know, a concept of, you know, a food or something that I want to talk about. And I got the idea to use actual beans and actual grains of rice, and to create like essentially what is the tiniest stencil I've ever used in any of my artwork. And so I basically layered beans and rice onto these panels, and then I spray painted over them, and wherever the bean was, like obviously that blocked the paint from, you know, adhering to the background, and just layered it and layered it and layered it, and created this sort of this really abstract sort of pattern that looked like polka dots, and kind of like you know, almost like the rice looked almost like confetti, the beans looked like dots, so we had a lot of dot patterns. And I was really pleased with the end result. And then at the end, I felt like I had this just really nice sort of abstract piece that if I didn't tell you what it was, you know, you might just appreciate it for the composition and just the colors that are used. But I think knowing the process of how it came together, you know, just adds to that narrative. So while I do like to work in abstraction, everything that I do like has meaning. Like it's not just, you know, art for art's sake. Like there's a story behind it, and there's a reason for the materials that I use and the colors that I choose and the way that I create the abstraction. In a way, I feel like what I'm trying to do is to claim that sort of artistic space for me, and like I said, for people like me, because, you know, I just feel like as a brown artist, like we're not always allowed to speak in the language of abstraction, in the language of modern art. Like we're not we're told that we have to paint the Virgin Mary, and we have to, you know, use the same sort of imagery over and over again. And so, you know, I'm trying to fight that stigma.
Hola, soy Virginia Díaz, Saiki, y soy de Perú. I live in Denver. I work at another artist studio, and I also have practice of my own at home. These two prints, estas dos estampillas, literalmente, se ocurrieron después de un viaje a Perú. Siempre mi familia trata de, we try to schedule the festivities in Peru for when we go and participate. Y estas dos estampillas son like kind of like a love story or a long distance love letter to me missing that interaction with these characters during, you know, Peruvian either Catholic holidays or Inca festivities. These mythological masks kind of appear regionally across Peru, and they all intermingle when there's a festivity or a celebration of a town or a region. Estas máscaras son súper especiales para mí. Una es de la sierra y otra es de la costa, que es pretty much my dual upbringing in Peru. Crecí en la costa y en la sierra, y mi intención es crear como un pequeño army de estas love letter stamps de las distintas regiones del Perú. These are reduction block prints. Creo que son como 7 o 8 colores each, y una de ellas tiene, well, son screen prints too. El borde de la estampa and the background are screen printed, and then the masks themselves have been reduction carved. Yo creo que as an expat in general, an immigrant, right? You're always neither from here nor there anymore. In reality, you become part of where you are at the moment, and you make the best of it here, you know. So we are divided, and maybe a lot of times emotionally and culturally, and language barriers, but I think what really unites us and makes immigrants in general unique is that they make the best of where they're at. And it doesn't really matter at the end if you're here or there. You're just doing what you do, and you carve your own way.
Hello, thank you. My name is Martin Mazzora. I am living and working in Brooklyn, New York. I am originally from Morgantown, West Virginia, where I did my undergraduate studies at West Virginia University. And I also studied at the American University in Washington, D.C. There's no denying that I am a Cuban American. This is my experience. Whether I speak Spanish, whether I, was, from Kendall or West Virginia, man, that's my experience as a Cuban American. And it's part of many different experiences that people have. There's definitely moments where you feel yourself being able to tap into that and being able to communicate specifically to that experience. I couldn't put a finger on it because I feel like it's kind of across the board that this is the kind of thing that I'm working from, like always working from. In my current work that I've included in this exhibition, I think that the pieces that I am the most proud of that I've recently completed was a piece called Crazy Arms, which is 2 inflatable air dancers that are about 18 to 20 feet tall that are sort of a self-portrait. They're covered in imagery of the tattoos that I have on my arms, and they stand in the gallery waving and flailing about kind of in an animated way that you would gesture when talking if you were an active storyteller. I think that the American style tattoos that I have and the gesturing of these things is also part of like a ubiquitous kind of Americana. And I think that kind of speaks to a tale, that I have to tell, as well as like the accumulation of all those tattoos that have personal significant meaning, but don't necessarily need to be my story. I think that they could speak to that kind of accumulation of history. Printmaking and the idea of making multiples really comes from, a accessibility. Making the work accessible to a larger group of people has been paramount throughout the 20 plus years that I've been making work. I think that being able to have the work and make it in such a way, consciously make it in such a way that it can be affordable to other people, but still have a sense of value. I very much engage in a commercial aspect of making work as an artist. I really do believe in that. But then I also use it to make some things that are not necessarily commercially viable, like these big inflatable arms or, giant collages and things like that are made basically just in the spirit of the experience of making work through a process. And I've made work for performance that is just going to exist in that moment. I think that I had to start making bigger prints because my eyesight started getting really bad. And ultimately, no, just kidding. But seriously, like to make things function in that really intimate scale is one that is really traditionally associated with printmaking. It, from book arts and that experience of the page to making work that could be experienced by a lot of different people. But when you make something that's like 4 by 8 feet, that's meant to be experienced with a group of people. So you're speaking to a larger audience at that point. You're opening that up to people experiencing that work together. It takes a lot of energy to make work on that scale. It takes a lot of space, to make work on that scale. Making it in 3 dimensions, it just, it's one of those things too, where it's just like, you kind of, what if it wrapped around a cardboard box? What if, it was on fabric and could be stretched and taken around? I came to letterpress in probably the early 2000s as a means to get to try and make my work better, so that you know, it was there as an opportunity to use it. And I found that there were aspects that I couldn't express with through imagery that I could do more directly and clearly with letterpress type. One of the pieces that I included in this exhibition is the Hammond Asset Hideout, which is a purely typographically driven piece. There are some illustrative elements that are in these things, but this, you know, piece that's in the show is about 11 by 11 feet. It's made up of a wood titling panel, or what I've been referring to as the valance, with the name Hammond Asset Hideout, and it has an angry clam that's been two-dimensionally cut out and stacked wood, so it's like a slight slow relief character that's placed above it. It's made up of two letterpress printed fabric banners that function like curtains, and they meet in the center of the piece. And the idea is that it alludes to the idea of something behind all of this text. And if you read the text, you could pretty much find my secret studio location in Clinton, Connecticut. But the secret location, you know, has all of these different things that I would see driving by on the way from Brooklyn to this studio that I've been keeping in Connecticut. You know, it's kind of a portrait, you know, through typography. So it was like the most direct way that I could get to it. I was really honored to be asked to participate in this exhibition, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how this exhibition gets pulled off.